Renewal and Removal: How the building of University of Illinois Chicago, or better known as Circle College, and the Eisenhower Expressway transformed Chicago's near west side, by Guy Trilla, Adam Siddiq, and Caleb McKeen. The redevelopment of Chicago's near west side tells a much bigger story than just construction projects. When the Eisenhower Expressway and what would now be known as Circle College were built, they didn't just change the landscape. They reshaped the entirety of some communities. City officials used tools like eminent domain and blight designations to clear out neighborhoods that were home to the working class, African Americans, Latino, and immigrant families. These decisions weren't neutral. They reflected priorities: connecting suburbs, expanding institutions, and making room for new development, while the people already living there were pushed aside.
This film documents the details of the Harrison-Halsted Urban Renewal Project in Chicago, Illinois, revealing how highway construction and expansion dismantled one of Chicago's most diverse and self-sustaining working-class neighborhoods. The aftermath displaced thousands of residents and destroyed hundreds of small businesses, while the city's relocation program failed to provide adequate housing alternatives. In 1929, Chicago's neighborhoods were full of life. Streets like this were not just places people passed through. They were where everyday life actually happened. People walked to work, stopped into local shops, talked with neighbors, and spent most of their time within a few blocks of where they lived.
What stands out in this image is how dense and connected everything feels. You can see storefronts packed next to each other, streetcars running through the road, and people walking the sidewalks. This environment made it easy for communities to grow because everything people needed was right there.
At the time, this wasn't seen as overcrowded or outdated, but rather as normal. This kind of density is actually what made cities like Chicago thrive. Different cultures lived side by side, and those everyday interactions built strong, lasting connections. What's important here is that this was already a working, functioning neighborhood long before anyone labeled it as a problem.
By the 1940s, the near west side had become one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Chicago. Immigrant communities from different backgrounds were living side by side, building lives in the same streets and creating a strong sense of community through their everyday routines.
Places like this deli were a huge part of that, and it was not just somewhere people grabbed food. It was somewhere you saw familiar faces, had conversations, and stayed connected to what was growing on around you. These kinds of small businesses helped give the neighborhood its identity and made it feel personal.
When you look at a place like this, you have to think beyond just the building itself. It represents relationships, culture, and a shared way of life. When urban renewal later removed places like this, it was not just physical space being lost, but it was everyday interactions and sense of belonging that disappeared with it. To understand what happened on Chicago's near west side, you have to understand the machinery that made it possible. After World War II, Congress passed the Housing Act of 1949, Title I, which started providing direct grants and loans to local urban renewal agencies.
Author Jane Jacobs, in her landmark work, The Death in life of the great American cities, argued that city planners were not saving neighborhoods, they were destroying functioning ones. The near west side of Chicago was cohesive, living melting pot of cultures. The effects of urban renewal ultimately demolished more housing than it ever built, at the expense of human communities and cultures.
The very conditions the city cited to justify the demolition of overcrowded housing, aging buildings, deteriorating infrastructure, were produced by the same government that would bulldoze these communities. Redlining by federal mortgage agencies had already deemed these neighborhoods hazardous for lending, cutting off investment and accelerating their physical decline.
One of the biggest turning points for the near west side came with the construction of the Eisenhower Expressway. This project presented as part of a larger effort to modernize the city and improve transportation, especially for suburban commuters traveling in and out of downtown.
But what this image shows is the human cost of that progress. In order to build the highway, thousands of residents were forced out of their homes. Entire sections of the neighborhood were cleared to make space for this road.
This was not just about the building infrastructure. The expressway physically cut through the community, dividing neighborhoods that had once been connected. Streets that people used every day were suddenly gone, and the social connections that held the area together became much harder to maintain.
What makes this even more significant is the people being displaced often had very few options. Because of segregation and housing discrimination, many families could not easily relocate to other neighborhoods.
So while the expressway made it easier for some people to move through the city, it made life much harder for the people who were already living there.
By the mid-1960s, the transformation of the near west side was complete. What had once been a dense and diverse neighborhood had been replaced by a completely different kind of space.
The University of Illinois Chicago campus now stood where homes, businesses, and community spaces had once existed. This image shows how dramatically the landscape had changed in a relatively short period of time.
Instead of narrow streets filled with activity, the area became more spread out and institutional. The design reflected the priorities of planners and developers, not the people who had originally lived there.
Even though the space was considered modern and improved, it did not replace what was lost. The sense of community, the relationships, and the everyday life that once existed in this area were gone.
The transformation of Chicago's near west side was total. What had once been a neighborhood of homes, churches, small businesses, and busy street life was replaced by highways, public housing, and the University of Illinois Chicago campus. The new campus severed what had been the old street grid connecting all the surrounding neighborhoods, replacing it with monolithic campus superblock.
The Italian community surrounding Taylor Street was reduced drastically, leaving only the restaurant district as a remnant. The Greek community relocated north to what is now Greektown. The commercial hub of Maxwell Street disappeared entirely, and Latino residents were forced to disperse to surrounding villages and communities far from the neighborhood that they had built.